I was so full of zeal and love for the Lord that I wanted to do all the devotion. And in wisdom, my spiritual director advised me to pick two.
This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Well, today on the program, we're talking about simplicity in the spiritual life. And with us as our spiritual director is Father Bobby Blood. Father Blood is the assistant principal and spiritual director at Boylan High School in the Diocese of Rockford, Illinois. Good morning, Father. How's your day going so far?
Good morning. It's great. The sun is shining. I think the Lord is blessing us at this beginning of Lent.
So it's a pretty simple day so far?
Simple day. Not too much going on.
Very good. Very good. Let's focus in on simplicity in the spiritual life as a desirable quality. What are and what aren't we talking about when we talk about simplicity?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is when Christ says that there's no duplicity in that man. Right? There's no division. There's no complication. You are what you are. And I think when we look at the spiritual life, we shouldn't overcomplicate it with many things. Right? We don't want to cloud the point of our spiritual life by trying to add a bunch of distracting elements. Instead, to zero in on what is the Lord simply inviting me into. And I think that's a relationship with Him. So as we talk today, I think it's helpful for us to almost pause and take the weight off our shoulders and say, it's just not that complicated. It's hard, but it's not complicated.
I think that's a good point, that it just because something is simple, that's another thing, is that we can describe simple, that crossword puzzle was pretty simple, meaning it was pretty easy. But in the way that we're talking about today, simplicity is not necessarily, doesn't mean easily accomplished.
Exactly, right? I think it's more an invitation to avoid complexity for complexity's sake.
Yes.
We want to enter back into what's the bare bones, the foundation, the most rudimentary call on our life from the very beginning, and allow that to be where we build from.
So why, Father, do you think that we're attracted to, in some cases at least, we're attracted to, or maybe, dare I even say, tempted toward complexity or complications in our spiritual life? Why do we seek to sometimes make it be about more than what it is?
I think sometimes we desire to know that we're doing a good job. Right? When you get feedback from a teacher, you get a grade, but I want to see what is the note that is written at the top of the page, right? That they're naming some good thing about it. We want to be able to see objectively, like, okay, I did what was expected of me. I've checked that box. And I think it's a normal human desire for us in the spiritual life to say, am I doing all the things that God would want for me? Am I completing everything that could be recommended to me? Because I think we're seeking some level of completion, right? Hoping that eventually I'll have beaten the spiritual life. I've done it all. I've got it all under my belt. But I don't know if that's really helpful, because we're never really done, and there's always more work to be done. And so we have to have some level of trust in the Lord that if I do my best and I give Him my day, that it's going to be beautiful in His eyes. Even if it isn't as cumbersome as maybe some in our community, this is what the Lord's inviting me into, and that's good enough.
Yeah, I like that. I think there is a temptation, isn't there, to try to say, look at all these things that I'm doing. In fact, what's popping to mind for me is the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, right? Or the Pharisee and the publican, where the Pharisee takes up position and spoke this prayer. And it's interesting, for example, I'm looking at the text from the Gospel of Luke right now. So this is Luke chapter 18. The Pharisee says, "Oh God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest." But then he says, he goes, "I fast twice a week. I pay tithes with my whole income." So it's almost like he's starting to make this list of things that this shows that I am successful in the spiritual life because I can do all these things. That seems to me what you're getting at, Father.
Absolutely. I think we want to be able to say that I've successfully done what's asked of me, and I deserve some praise for that. Mm-hmm. I want to feel good about the fact that I don't miss Sunday Mass. I want to feel good that I've prayed a rosary every day for however many days. But that temptation, I think, leads us away from the heart of our spiritual life, because then it again points at the focus back on us and what our merits are, and away from the Lord and what He's doing in the midst of this relationship.
So I think another thing too, Father, is as long as we're talking about these temptations toward the complicated, you mentioned in kind of the educational realm, you want to see what is the teacher saying about, did we do what was necessary? Did we do what was expected of us? It seems like in the wider world, perhaps in the secular world, I'm thinking particularly in the corporate world, there has to be some degree of self-promotion. And, I'm thinking of like putting together a resume, for example, that in a resume, we want to show that there have been, all these we've received all these accolades, we've accomplished all these things, perhaps we've published all these articles or books. And that, too, is another area of life where we tend to try to say that my complicated life actually shows forth more of my worth.
Yeah, and it's can be dangerous because what does the Lord see in us, right? He knows our heart and our disposition and our desires and our efforts, and he knows all of those things on a deeper level. He doesn't just know that we maybe had all these devotions or done all these things. He knows the disposition of the heart. Did I engage with him in the midst of these things I'm doing? And I think that's really the call for us to start to ask the question, am I engaging with my whole self in my spiritual life? Is this just an external thing that I'm doing? And I think that's a lifelong sort of battle or effort to find this integration where it doesn't become a list of things, but they become signs to what's happening inside, right? The world can see the faith that God has given me because they see these external things I'm doing, but it's really what's happening on the interior level that matters the most.
So what would you say, Father, are some of the signs that maybe we are making our spiritual lives too complicated, or maybe we are falling into that trap of saying, I am like the Pharisee or the Pharisees in general who got accused of this, I think, a lot of times, is leaving love out of the equation, and it's not so much about a relationship, but more of what we can do. We just heard the gospel from Matthew on the Sermon on the Mount, and we just talking about, Pharisees love to fast and show that they're fasting. Pharisees love to pray and show that they're praying. And he says, don't be like them. So what are some of the signs that we can say, maybe I am being a little more like a Pharisee in this?
I would maybe ask the question, what is your disposition when you leave a time of prayer? Right? Sometimes we go into prayer and you're doing hard work with the Lord and you can feel some sense of unrest because you're still working. But if there's no shift at all, if there's you walk out of prayer and it's like it didn't even happen, I would say, okay, maybe we got to try something different. Because if we're not really engaging with what's going on interiorly, we might have missed the boat a little bit. So that's the first thing. And two, I would maybe start to notice, why did you start doing certain things in the spiritual life? I know being in the seminary and now as a priest, the spirit of comparison can reign.
Oh,
well,
sure.
All these other people are doing those things, so I need to do those things. Well, if the Lord hasn't invited me to participate in that way, I shouldn't feel any shame about not doing it. So I would start to ask those questions of, in my spiritual life, the things I'm doing, is it a prompting of the Lord, an invitation by Him, or have I made this list based on my own desire to do many things, or because of comparison to a brother or sister in Christ, and start to really ask those deeper questions of, why am I engaging in the first place? Because the hope would be, as we deepen in the spiritual life, we'll notice in our times of prayer that we'll experience rest and renewal and a little more hope.
I like that you brought up the whole comparison thing, Father, because indeed that's a virus that spreads far and wide, I think, in the spiritual life, be it from, seminarians, as you mentioned, to clergy, to laity, I mean, all around the world, comparing ourselves with others. But at the same time, especially since this is a show that's all about spiritual direction, right? We want to say that there are those that we want to try to emulate. St. Paul himself, of course, says, be imitators of me. So if there's something along the lines of, there are people who have gone before us that we would like to emulate, or if there are people who are in our lives that we want to become more like, what does that mean in terms of adopting some of their same spiritual practices?
It's a thin line of discernment, in the sense of, there are a lot of folks I've learned from where I say, like, oh, they pray in this certain way or have these habits that I want to have. And the interior disposition starts to make the distinction whether it's a good or a bad thing for us to chase it. Is my interior disposition, I'm jealous that they have it, or I'll never be holy unless they have it, or any of those sort of like mental gymnastics we play that are unhelpful? Or is it, I'm moved by their faith and I desire to fall more madly in love with the Lord, and I can learn from them and I want to try it. And the externals can look exactly the same. And so in our own individual discernment and our own conscience, we ask the question, okay, where's that coming from? Is that an invitation of the Lord? Did he present this person in my life to help feed me? Or is this leading me down toward a path that is maybe more negative and comparison based? And it's hard work, but worth it to start having that conversation with the Lord, because really that's what he wants, is this dialogue. And so being able to say, Lord, I feel sort of called to participate in this. Lord, what do you think about that? And then see what you feel in prayer. Maybe there's a deep sense of peace and you see the Lord giving you the green light, or he might say like, that's a good thing, but not right now. And we can trust him on that.
I think one of the things, too, that I've noticed in my own spiritual life, Father, is that sometimes I can be in a place of pretty, I would say, consolation, certainly, when I feel like I'm in a good place with the Lord. I am pursuant after the Lord for all the right reasons, trying to build my relationship with him when I take on a spiritual practice, a new spiritual practice. But then over the course of time, it starts to become perhaps more burdensome or more rote, or it loses, for instance, the heart of things, I guess. So does that ever happen? I mean, is that legitimate, that a spiritual practice can grow stale?
I think the spiritual practices in themselves are good, but I think sometimes we might be in a place where we're not able to engage with the same spiritual practices we did in the past. And in that, right, I would never say, like, when you're in desolation, stop doing whatever prayer routine or regimen you're used to, because that's not when we make decisions clearly. But maybe it's an invitation to try something new, to say that, okay, Lord, I've been faithful to this and I want to continue to be faithful in prayer, but I'm going to, put this on the back burner for now, and I'm going to try something new. Well, I got my Lenten email from Father Rocky. I'm going to pray on this today and see how that feeds me. So I would say it's okay to start to ask those questions.
Jonathan is calling in from Philadelphia. Jonathan, good afternoon and welcome.
Yes, so I just had a quick comment. When my conversion happened, I got a spiritual director, and I was so full of zeal and love for the Lord that I wanted to do all the devotion. And in wisdom, my spiritual director advised me to pick 2, try them out for 6 months, and if they're fruitful, continue them. If not, try something else. And it really grounded me, and I eventually ended up landing on the Jesus prayer and praying Liturgy of the Hours. But now I have a whole slew of beautiful devotions in my back pocket in case I ever need them.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and sometimes we need that wisdom to be able to say, more is not always better. Better is better. But it's beautiful that, you receive that spiritual director's advice not as like you didn't leave disappointed. You took the advice and it was fruitful, and I think continues to help us stretch those muscles. Right? Sometimes we're not ready to carry all of these things at once, and it's good for us to just to choose. Okay, what's step 1? I'm going to do step 1 really well, and then maybe when I'm ready and the Lord invites, then we move on to step 2. So I think that's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, if I may, let me jump in and ask. So how did you know that, for instance, the Jesus prayer and Liturgy of the Hours, how did you know that they were fruitful? How did you recognize that in your spiritual life?
That's a great question. So like Father was saying, how I felt, my disposition afterwards, peace, coming from a background of no religion and not really ever experiencing serenity, I knew very well what was going on. So it was kind of easy for me to recognize, like, wow, this is helpful. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't worried about things.
It's very good, Jonathan. Really appreciate the call and appreciate the insight that you've given us there. And I think, like you were saying, Father, sometimes more isn't better, better is better. And that might not be a bad way of starting out if somebody is looking to maybe just make some foray rather than taking on a whole cadre of new devotions, but rather just look to 1 or 2 and be fervent in them. This entire episode of The Inner Life is on the Relevant Radio app. The Relevant Radio app is completely free and updated daily with fresh articles, podcasts, and prayers. Don't delay. Download the app today. And thanks for listening.